Welcome to the first video of this series, which I'm calling History of Spaceflight. We're starting with the first successful orbital launch ever, the Sputnik 1 launch on the R7 rocket, which is actually a repurposed ICBM. I'm actually going to be turning this in for some aerospace, basically as an aerospace lesson. So I have not tested this at all. It is just basically a completely new rocket. Just kind of like how the Russians felt. I'm just gonna see how well this flies, if it flies at all. Alright. Has a kind of good thrust-to-weight ratio, but let's just hit launch. Launch anyway. This has no parachute because it's gonna be in orbit, hopefully. Loading. This thing is using the probe instead of the capsule, so it doesn't have as much torque, so it might be a pain to turn while in orbit. If it reaches orbit. Alright. So here we are, and let me just check something. Is this doing what it's supposed to? Okay, yeah, good. So, we are go for launch. I'm just going to turn on the engines. Throttle this to full, and then the second we press this on button, we will be flying. And you can see that poor thrust-to-weight ratio trying to get in on this. But as we get higher and lose more fuel, we will get better thrust. So, just waiting for this to hit about the right height. We're going to rotate around to 5 degrees. Too far. There. Just really want to get in on this gravity turn to get us into an orbital velocity. 10 degrees now. This is kind of a bad representation of the R7, but it's the best I could do. Just gonna rotate around to 20. Dude, stop! I'm trying to film a video, David.
Sorry, no, I just wanted
rotating
to say
around
hi.
to 20 degrees.
You can explain that so it doesn't sound weird.
Rotate to 30
You better
degrees.
explain that so it doesn't sound weird.
Leave me alone, please, David. I'm trying to film a video. We're starting to gain some speed, but we really need to get to the high orbital velocity speeds in order to make it. This craft really likes to side slip. Oh, we're going to ditch the boosters soon, which will look cool, but seriously drop the thrust to weight on this. Boop. Oh gosh. Is this even going to achieve orbit, or am I going to have some kind of impartial credit for aerospace?
Indeed.
Okay.
And they're dead. Cut the dead weight, Gabe.
Just like the Russian craft ditching those side boosters to cut down on weight. But was it enough? That is, at least we're not losing velocity. That would not be good. David, please leave.
Haley, get off of there. Get off the puzzle.
Just gonna keep this 75-degree angle, because in fact, I'm gonna try to go back to 45 degrees. See, we're about 50 degrees. Try to raise that. Try to raise the AFOAPs here. Okay, our AFOAPS is above 30 kilometers, thus we are suborbital, but exceeding heating the atmosphere. David, stop. I'm trying to do something.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to get to about 45 kilometers. No, I'm going to get this into a high elliptical orbit. That's kind of what Sputnik did. Sorry about this cluttered airspace. I've just really I've been doing a lot of things in this game. The game we're playing, Spaceflight Simulator, has a bunch of different saves in it. Okay, I'm just gonna get to about 60 kilometers, which might or might not be the real Sputnik's orbital parameters, but I'm more focusing on actually getting this thing to orbit right now, because if I don't, then that would be very sucky. Yes, Sputnik actually went into orbit.
No, you got your Sputnik to go into orbit.
I got it suborbital. It might go orbital here, if I can get.
But you're out of fuel.
No, I'm not. Look at my liquid fuel.
Oh,
Oh, we might actually go suborbital.
I think you are.
Yes.
I mean,
Okay.
Complete orbital.
Okay, I'm gonna switch around and raise my apoaps now by just continuing this burn. I'm just gonna put it on some crazy elliptical orbit. Now we can deploy this bearing, revealing our payload.
Boing.
Just gonna end mission and end mission to get rid of that stuff. And now we can deploy the payload. And end mission. Here we have our Sputnik 1 satellite. It's not a good representation of it, but I'm using the blocky spaceflight simulator parts, so hey, give me a break. Alright, that was the Sputnik 1 launch. Pretty simple. Oh, why won't you let me... Okay, there. So, let's see. I will be right back after I do a bit more research and figure out what happened on the Sputnik 2 launch, or what launch came next. Because I'm just going to be gone for a second. Okay, bye. Okay, so we're back. So, after some research, I found out what we're doing next, which is Sputnik 2. It's gonna be basically a bit different of a satellite. It was actually the first animal into orbit, containing in a small spherical container the dog Laika. Unfortunately, the Russians left their dog to die in orbit, which it did after a matter of hours, even though it had the supplies for a week. But we're not the Russians, no. So we're actually providing it with a way to return back to Earth, which isn't actually realistic, but I'm not gonna let a dog die in orbit. Anyway, so we're just gonna build a similar payload as the... Oh, oops. Let me back this up one. There, now we're gonna scooch this entire assembly. Oh, in fact, anyway, so I'm just building the actual cabin, which in reality was a spherical container, but there are no actual round objects in this game, so I'm going to be using the standard, the standard capsule for the game. Then they had the transmitter systems. This contained all the required stuff to send signals to and from Earth, and is on Earth, and well, It sat above the experiment, and it sat below the experiments where a bunch of science experiments were held, including a sensor that looked for Van Allen radiation belts around Earth, but these radiation belts actually clogged it, meaning it couldn't send signals back to Earth. And then the actual satellite had no propulsion, but we need a way to return this capsule to Earth. So the experiments bay will consist of a fuel tank and a small return engine with experiments strapped onto the sides. For instance, I'm just going to use this rover wheel in place of any actual experiment. And then we're going to need a way to turn the craft in orbit, so let's add these RCS thrusters. Okay, so here we have our Sputnik 2 satellite. So now we're going to need to add the fairing on top. The fairing is actually what protects the craft during launch from atmospheric drag breaking everything apart, which is actually a big deal when it comes to rocketry. In the early days, anything built wrong, and the whole craft usually fell apart. If the fairing was put together wrong, the whole craft would fall apart, which is a kind of a big deal because you want everything to survive, right? So we have to add on this fairing here, and we're going to have to slide this down. I'm just gonna put this one down too and add another one of these larger fairings, and now we have the fairing on top of our rocket, and I think that is good to go. So I'm just gonna turn up the separation force so that it clears the payload nice and cleanly without hitting against anything, because you really don't want anything to bump against anything in space. That was actually a major thing. The astronauts found a window on the shuttle had been completely stabbed through by a paint chip. It had literally impaled itself inside the window. Luckily, there was no oxygen leak, but they had to be extremely careful. The window had several cracks in it, and it was perceived that a piece of paint from another rocket launch had been hurtling along at orbital velocities and randomly smashed into the window, which is why you really don't want anything bumping up against anything, because debris is extremely deadly. Although there is no microscopic debris in this game, but it would add a bit of randomness to it if they actually allowed such things. So we've got that separation force done. So I'm going to use a docking port here because it will attach to the parachute of the capsule, but when the docking port releases, there's nothing left on the capsule and it won't accidentally try to reconnect. So we've already got this is the same rocket I used last time, so I've already got the separation force turned up on these side booster separators. Just gonna select the fairing. So when I'm using the action groups in this game, so in the game, all this will appear on the right side with a little play button. When you press it, whatever group is set up will trigger, i.e. fire the engines, or separate this, or deploy that. It's really good for setting up like satellite deployments. Anyway, after that finally deploys, we're going to have that separate, the engine turn on, and the RCS activate. And then later, after all the data is collected and it decelerates, we're going to have deployment of that parachute, and deployment of that parachute again at a lower altitude where it can fully deploy. And our dog, which will be inside this canister, will not die, unlike the Russians. Right, let's go to launch. I realize I'm just rambling a bit. This is one of my favorite topics, and I just ramble a bit about things like this. Anyway. So, we're gonna go. This takes a little while to load without glitching out a couple seconds. So we've got engines on, throttled full, and we're firing. There again, we have that crazy low, we have that really low, thrust to weight ratio. Oh, okay. Looks like we're going to be moving over to somewhere else because my brother's watching something. So we're going to turn to 5 degrees. So we're just waiting for our Apple apps to raise so we can get that 10 degrees on the gravity turn. 10 degrees. Oop, too far. We've got a bit extra torque now because of the capsule attached, which has a higher torque rate than the probe. In fact, we should have like the probe plus the capsule because I put the probe on as the transmitter. So we should have a really high torque rate now, which is good because we need all that torque to turn the vehicle while in orbit. Okay, 30 degrees. Oh, a little too far. The computer in this is a little overzealous. It'll say like you're 30 degrees when you're a couple degrees to either direction. See, you can see I was 32 degrees rather than just simply 30. And right when I got around 42, it was like, okay, you're good enough. In fact, we may have too low of a thrust weight to achieve orbit this time. That's okay, we'll just say we encountered the same difficulties as the original R7 rocket, in which one of the side boosters actually had trouble throttling up to speed as opposed to the others. Oh, and those side boosters are out of fuel, so we're going to dump them to drop our weight. And we're going to turn high again, because we really want to raise our apoaps outside the atmosphere. It doesn't matter what we do as long as our apoaps gets outside the atmosphere so we can actually turn. We really want to gravity turn. We've got about 58% now in the tanks. Okay, 25 kilometers. You can time warp in this game for burns, which is pretty helpful when you want to, say, get to a prograde or retrograde burn very fast. But it also makes things a little complicated because, like, you can't time warp below a certain point, and you can't time warp while engines are burning, and it just adds a little bit of complication to the game, in my opinion. So I'm just gonna, like the last one, throttle this up to a high, maybe 100. So we've escaped Earth's atmosphere now. That's our old Sputnik 1. So I'm just gonna, actually, no, we'll put this into like a 40-kilometer orbit. So I'm just gonna throttle down to turn this engine back on. So all I have to do when we hit prograde is fire the thruster and just throttle up again, and we'll have a good burn. Just rotating the rocket. You might be able to hear my brother's, what he's watching in the background. Throttle up. Like I said before, we just really want to burn these engines and get a good periaps. I'm going to start to angle upwards, because when you angle upwards during a burn, you kind of lower your apoaps, but you really raise your periaps, kind of transition all that up from the apoaps into the periaps. For those of you who don't know, apoaps, think apogee, peak of flight, that kind of stuff. It's the very top arc it's the very top of a ballistic arc, whereas periaps is the very bottom. Alright, so we really want to bring our periaps just above 30. In fact, I think I'll give this a 50-kilometer orbit. So we're going to accelerate. The Sputnik satellite had batteries to run everything for a few days. But this game doesn't have any kind of power system yet. The power system hasn't had an overhaul, so I don't really use power. I use solar panels for decoration, and in the small chance that power gets added and some of my craft are out there with no means of power, I like to give them solar panels just in case, but there's no real power yet. Okay, so we're about 50 kilometers, so we can dish this fairing. I'll remove that. So now and then we can undock. Now we have a craft that's a bit like the one before. But then again, and it has some other stuff attached. So I'm just going to use the RCS because they're a bit more precise. So we'll just ride this orbit for a couple days. Alright. And now remember, we want to return our dog here. So we're going to get to Apoapс and we're going to slow down. I'm going to rotate the front of the craft, or actually the back technically. Now that I look at it, it looks more like a back to the craft, like the craft was sitting upside down. We're about Apoapse, so we're going to throttle up and drop our periaps below the Earth. In fact, we really want to get some lateral, a lot of the lateral con. We want a nice descent corridor, not too shallow, not too steep. That looks like a good re-entry corridor there. Now we're going to ride this towards the top of the atmosphere. Getting there. So I'm just going to rotate this, preparing for re-entry. And okay, we're getting there, so I'm just going to pop off this capsule. Okay, we've entered Earth's upper atmosphere. And I'm not going to use time warp to get down because this game, like some other space game, uses an on-rails time warp, meaning things like gravity and atmospheric drag don't affect it during time warp, which would be very bad because we want the atmospheric drag on this heat shield to slow us down to parachute deployment velocity. And we're about 19 kilometers now. Descending towards the surface. This is a bit steep, but that's okay because it means we have, not steep, shallow, but that's okay. We have a bit more time in the atmosphere for this heat shield to really break us. And you can see the stars are going, the sky is starting to get blue, which is good. It means we are dropping into the atmosphere, and our dog here should be feeling a bit of heat. The game doesn't have atmospheric entry correct yet. They don't have re-entry particles or strain, but that will come in a future update. This is one of my favorite games in the term of space because it's got a bit realistic, but also a bit easier than full-on like Kerbal Space Program for players, like kind of a transition. Alright, so our capsule is... Alright, let's see if that other stage is gonna smash into the ground before us. Gonna smash into the ground before us, like it's a good thing. It looks like it might, because it doesn't have this heat shield here slowing it down. In fact, are we close enough that we could see the boom of it going off? Oh, 24 kilometers, so we're just gonna deploy the parachute. Parachute half deployed. You can see it's kind of more of this kind of cup shape, but it's definitely decelerating us. Come on, do we see some exploding anywhere? Do we see any exploding? No, I hit, but we didn't see it. Dang. Oh well, that's alright. When we get to about 400, and when we get below 500 meters, we can deploy this parachute fully. And you can see I'm not using any of this anymore. I'm focusing on the action groups because that's what gives us control over deployment. You can simply tap it if you want, but I like the action groups. Oh, we're below 500, so this parachute will fully deploy and bring our velocity around 5.5 meters per second, which is very good. We want to decelerate and we want to get going very slow as we head towards the ground. It would not be very good to crash into the ground at like 15 meters per second. Even 15 meters per second, that's like still pretty fast of a collision. 15 meters, yeah, that would slamming into the ground at 15 meters per second would definitely not be good. So we're just gonna make sure that this parachute, and we ride this parachute all the way down to the ground. That way, nothing bad happens. And we want to get going very slow as we head towards the ground. It would not be very good to crash into the ground at like 15 meters per second. Even 15 meters per second, that's like still pretty fast of a collision. 15 meters, yeah, that would definitely break the gap zone. We don't want to kill our dog, do we? We're not the nasty Russians. We're not going to let it suffocate in orbit. In reality, the dog died hours instead of a week after it was supposed to, due to stress and overheating of the payload. But regardless, right, about 80 meters above the surface of the Earth. Oh, here we go. We can see the ground. There we go. And our dog is safe. With that, we will end this mission. So I'm just gonna go to build new rocket, and I will be back. Let me just... And with this, we come to our third and final vehicle, the Vanguard rocket. This was the third Vanguard launch, or was it the second? Anyways, it failed, unfortunately, but it was the third launch of the year 1957. So I'm not going to bore you with the details of how I construct this. I will build it and then bring it to you. And I'm back, and here we have my representation of the Vanguard rocket. So, the Vanguard rocket was a 3-stage launch vehicle. The actual launch of the vehicle managed to get about 4 feet off the pad before the main engine stopped and it basically obliterated itself. The Vanguard satellite on top managed to survive, but we don't want a failure, do we? So, I know it's not the actual mission statement, but I'm thinking I'm gonna see if this thing could have actually theoretically, or at least in this game, made a satellite get to orbit. So I'm just gonna start messing with the separation forces on these engines. So the main Vanguard rocket used a single liquid oxygen and I think it was RP1 system engine. The second stage used a single more efficient hydrazine and nitric acid second stage. The third stage contained a small solid rocket motor, but this game doesn't have solid fuel yet, so I'm replacing it with the second strongest engine in the game, which is the Hawk liquid fuel engine. Anyway. So, I'm just going to start setting up the action groups real quick. So, this game doesn't have much in the way of realistic looking, scientific parts. So I've used these landing legs and I've clipped them inside each other, but they'll fold out and look like the aerials that extended from the Vanguard satellite. So we're going to have those engines fire, then uncovery of that and deployment of these. Then finally we'll deploy that, leaving behind the Vanguard satellite in orbit. And as you can see, it's not spherical unlike the real Vanguard satellite, but as I've mentioned before, there are no spheres in this game, which is kind of annoying, but who cares? Anyway, let's launch. This thing actually has a good thrust to weight ratio on the first stage, which is the big importance. The second stage usually is used outside the atmosphere or at the top of the atmosphere, in the case of the Vanguard at least, so I think we should be good. That's the middle stage uses a more fuel efficient, less thrusty fuel system. So, in fact, let's just have a little bit of show here. So we're just gonna lift off here and get a bit up and then whoop. Uh-oh. Okay, so I decided maybe I would do the real Vanguard just for fun. Oh, come on. And it has no thrust to weight. So I'm just gonna blow this up real quick. And okay, so that's kind of what happened, except the real Vanguard satellite managed to clear the explosion. It was unusable, but still broadcasted its signal strangely enough, which allowed the people to track it down in the nearby field. Oh, wait, what? Where's my transmit antenna? Okay, things are just disappearing left and right. I had this cool little antenna looking thing. So I've got engine on, and boop. Okay, so this thing has a kind of good thrust to weight. Hydrazine nitric acid isn't actually that good of is a pretty efficient propulsion, but not very well thrust. So it's usually used nowadays on things like RCS or reaction control system engines, just to give a fuel efficient push around. We'll get to RCS in a bit, because not many early rockets had RCS systems. So we're now going to 30 degrees. Oh, this thing really wants to side slip, as you can see. Okay, we're going to 45 degrees, which is not good. It might actually not have that much of a thrust to weight. The second we light up the second engine, it's not going to be very good. In fact, I might change that to a different engine in a little. And watch our thrust to weight ratio drop to like nothing. Oh, never mind, we're making good headway. Looks like we're riding the momentum from the first stage. So maybe if I angle back a little, I can start to raise our apoaps. We might not reach orbit at this rate, though. Yeah, we're getting closer to our apoaps than we should. You know what? New plan. Ditch the second stage. Go with third stage. Maybe we can make it to orbit on this. Imagine if the real Vanguard engineers saw me doing this. They'd probably, like, fire me or something. Even now, we're not getting much thrust. Okay, so we might not get orbital. Worst case scenario, I do some crazy maneuvering and manage to land this thing on its tail on Earth again. Oh, well, we might get there. Okay. Where are you, mister? I'll put this in a 70-kilometer orbit. Or in this case, 73.4-kilometer orbit. I was not expecting this to get into orbit, but sometimes expectations change. Oh, okay. In reality, this thing would have been firing for a while by now, and we might have even exceeded escape velocity. But this is not a real Vanguard rocket. This is simply a replica. A semi-well done replica at that. Yes, how humble, how human, what is the word again? How humble, I should say. Oh, and mission. And there you see those legs deployed. Those look like the aerials of the real Vanguard satellite. Give me a sec. Let me switch over to Google. Back. Yeah, this is the Vanguard satellite. Here the Vanguard, the 6.5-inch Vanguard satellite. You can see all those aerials coming off. That's kind of what I tried to do with the landing legs here. So we should be coming up on our Apoap's burn soon. Let me just skip ahead a little. You can't do that in real life. I bet you some space agencies wish they could to get through things like Jupiter transitions. Those are usually pretty long. Okay, so we've got a good, decent orbit. So now we can and mission, and boom, Vanguard satellite. Alright, so let's stop the spinning. I said stop the spinning. Okay. This thing has some pretty good torque, actually. So, now that we have our Vanguard satellite, I guess that's it for the, year 2000, the year 1957. Alright, I'll see you next time for 1958, Space History.